Hello and welcome to today's video. In today's video I'm going to be discussing incels and the entitlement that incels apparently feel towards sex, but I'm going to be discussing other things and the topic of entitlement more broadly. I first want to address whether it's wrong to feel entitled to something. So, what I mean by entitled is someone who thinks that something should be given to them. And because I'm very conservative, I've come from the sphere of thinking nobody's entitled to anything, and that's just how life is. And recently it's changed to, actually, there should be some entitlements that people should have. And I'm not necessarily saying those entitlements should be total entitlements, but I would say that those entitlements should be, to some extent, qualitative. And what I mean by qualitative is they're seen as ideals that should be available to most people. So in terms of legal entitlements that are absolute, in the UK, if you're under 16, you have an absolute right to education. And that education has to be free, so the state pays for it. Obviously, for something like incels, that would be very difficult to do with sex, and I don't think it should be done. However, I don't think it's unreasonable for incels to have a qualitative, so by that I mean a right that is adjusted within proportions to having a partner or having someone that loves them, and even sex. So what I mean by a qualitative right here is I don't mean that the state gives incels prostitutes or something like that. That would be ridiculous and immoral. But what I am saying is the people who are in charge of society, the elites, as AA calls them, the octopus, probably should structure society in such a way that allows for the significant number of incels these days, who a lot of them aren't actually losers or losers in the complete sense, to have a wife or have an opportunity to have a wife. So I don't think it's necessarily wrong for someone to feel entitled to sex or female company, because if you look at it logically, everybody needs friends and everybody needs other things in life to be happy or feel fulfilled. I mean, if you have no friends, I would argue, and this is something I've noticed, you won't just be unhappy, you will be depressed, anxious, and there are logical reasons for this, because maybe up until 100 years ago or so, if you didn't have friends and people you trusted who loved you and you loved them back, you would be at serious risk of death. Either dying of starvation, dying of the cold, and other reasons. So it's completely natural for incels, and normally incels have no friends, to feel depressed. I mean, I think if most people watching this were honest, if they didn't have their friends or their partner or whoever, they would be seriously depressed too. So I don't think it's morally wrong for incels to feel a qualified entitlement to women and happiness. Because, as I say, it shouldn't be an absolute right. There should be steps that are taken by an elite that is virtuous and genuinely cares about the underlings, the peasant class, to make the peasant class happy and fulfilled and live their lives in a moral way. I want to expand on the topic of entitlement here because, as I've said in terms of qualified entitlement, I don't think it's wrong for people to have or feel entitled to something if it's proportionate. And it really depends on what the proportionality level is. I mean, most incels aren't just annoyed about them not having sex, because there are other things that come with being sexually unattractive to women or even repulsive to women. You get treated like absolute garbage. Which basically, if you're a woman watching this, you probably can't relate or the times when you'll be treated like garbage isn't necessarily the same as with an incel, but I'll try and explain it as best I can. If you're an incel, or even someone who's perceived as being sexually unattractive for whatever reason, it's very hard to have a conversation with somebody. I mean, most incels are incels for a reason, or a significant number are they're disabled, they have really poor social skills. Your life is crap, because whenever you talk to people, especially women, even in a way where you're not hitting on them or anything like that, they'll probably whisper about you, probably be reluctant to help you. And that's quite depressing for somebody, because if somebody can't hold a conversation with someone, or they sit next to someone on the bus and that person moves, that's going to be very depressing for you, because it's rude. It's also incredibly unkind, because if you're the type of person who is sat there and someone sits near you and you move, that person will notice that and they'll feel awful. And I think this is the main issue that I think incels have, because not only do they not have access to sex, but they also don't have any friends in most cases, because a lot of people find them repulsive and won't allow them or socialise with them. So I don't think it's an unfair entitlement for someone to have, that they feel that they are entitled in a proportionate way. So obviously I'm not on about handing prostitutes to people, to female company and female sex, because whenever I hear this talked about online, it's talked about as an absolute entitlement, and half the time I've never heard an incel say they want the state to give them prostitutes. If someone can link me to that in the comments, please do. But what I'm trying to get at throughout this video is most incels aren't necessarily entitled, or don't feel a sense of entitlement to female sex. What they're doing is, and I don't think moaning about a problem on the internet is a very productive way of dealing with it, but they're moaning about a problem that exists and is affecting them. I think that's quite... What I think most people need to look at the incel question is, lots of people are moaning about the price of food. You are not really entitled to food. I mean, in some cases, in some countries, you are. The state does entitle you to basic positive rights, such as food and things like that. But petrol, for example, lots of people moan about the price of petrol, and I think they have good reason to, because the reason petrol is so high and expensive and unaffordable for some people is because the current elites made, especially with the Ukraine crisis, a series of decisions that have unfortunately raised the price of a basic good such as petrol and food, and that affects people. I think, talking about essential resources, I think it's perfectly reasonable for someone to be angry that essential resources such as food have been made unavailable because of stupid decisions the government has made. And I think with the incel question and incels, it's the same thing. They're moaning that women have been made unavailable to them because part of it is feminism, because women have been told, especially at universities and other institutions, that every awkward encounter they have with somebody is sexual harassment. That's not really something that's conducive to a positive society, because it basically means that any woman who has an awkward encounter with someone who's maybe autistic or who's got terrible social skills can ruin that person's life. And a lot of the times women will try it. So I saw this woman in a cafe. There's this guy who was quite certainly on the spectrum. I'm not sure whether he had autism or Down syndrome or something. He certainly had quite a serious speech impediment, which, if anyone's got a speech impediment, I mean, I have epilepsy that isn't very well controlled, so sometimes when my epilepsy is really bad, my speech will be slurred and I'll talk like I've got cerebral palsy. Nothing against people with cerebral palsy, but that's the only way I can really describe it. Back to my story about this man. I mean, I think he was about 18. he just started talking to this girl, and because this girl was clearly uncomfortable because of the way he talks. He talks in a way that I think most people would be uncomfortable with, and started asking her, "Oh, how was your day?" I mean, the accent was sort of like that. I shouldn't really mimic it, but because that's rude. But I'm just trying to give you an idea of what that man's accent was like, or voice. And the coffee person went over to him and said, "Stop making that woman uncomfortable." And it's like, he's just talking to her, asking her about the weather. Even if you are uncomfortable with someone who has a disability like that, you should be polite enough either to engage with them or allow it. I mean, this man, I was stood behind him, he didn't do anything physical, or it's not like he had an erection or anything, or something that would most right-thinking people would think is inappropriate. But when I listen to incels, and I've met a few because I tutor public speaking, and a lot of the people who hire me to tutor them, some of them are quite high-functioning incels, so incels who are managers in financial institutions or whatever. The main gripe they have is they don't feel comfortable talking to women, and when they do, they're made to feel like a creep, which I don't imagine is a very healthy or nice thing for someone to feel. Now we've sort of decided throughout the video, hopefully you'll agree with me, that it isn't actually that bad to have a proportional entitlement to something. For example, I'm for low immigration because I don't want immigrants coming in undercutting native British workers. I mean, where I'm from, where I grew up, which was a tax haven, the tax haven didn't allow immigration when I was a young child, and waiters and waitresses would be on about £12 to £14 an hour, whereas even with inflation, their wages have gone down because they've allowed immigrants. So you'll be lucky if you get £10 an hour as a barman or someone working in hospitality. So I don't think it's an unreasonable expectation within reason for someone not to want immigrants to take their jobs or reduce the value of their labour. And I also think it's a completely reasonable entitlement to have if you're somebody who perhaps has poor social skills that are possibly the result of poor choices by your parents in allowing you to be socialised on the screen. I don't think it's unfair or unreasonable for you to have a proportionate entitlement to sex, or at least female attention, or be treated in a way that isn't extremely rude and harmful to your mental health. I mean, I've touched on this, but I don't think it's just the sex that most incels have a problem with. I think it's the way they get treated in wider life. Because I'll tell my own story. I'm not an incel. However, I can understand and I feel that I can empathise with them, because when my epilepsy is really bad, sometimes I walk funny, I twitch, I talk really badly, like I've got cerebral palsy, and I just get treated awfully. When I'm in the supermarket, for example, I'll get people like pointing and staring at me and whispering about me as if I can't notice. And I imagine if you're an incel and you give off weird things and you have weird hand gestures, I can imagine it's the same for incels. So they're not going to feel comfortable talking to a bloke, let alone a woman. And I think wanting that to stop, or wanting things to be better for you, is certainly a proportionate entitlement to have, because luckily for me, my epilepsy isn't that bad that often. I hope and pray that it will continue. However, if your life is like that every day, I can imagine why it's very depressing and why you would hate women or people like that. Because if the women are the manifestation of your problem, I can completely understand hating them. I'm not saying you should, but I can understand why you would. Thank you very much for watching. Please check out the links below. There's the link to my Open Oratory channel, which hopefully that'll help you with your public speaking if that's something you struggle with and you can't afford to hire me privately. Also, there is my Substack, which is based on legal and political strategy. Feel free to comment any questions you have. If you disagree with me, I want to hear from you.